Good morning, everyone. Thanks for waking up early after last night or this morning's escapades. Before I start, I don't work for Adobe, not endorsed with them or anything like that, so hold your pitchforks, hold your rotten tomatoes, please be nice. Right, my name's Darren Wallace. I'm a systems engineer from DataJar. You can find me in most places, Slack, Twitter, etc. as Daz Wallace. I've been quite active in the Adobe channel, funnily enough. I've been working for Macs for over 14 years now. Started out as a hardware tech back in the day, right through to consultancy, now systems engineering. I also help run the London Apple admins back home in the UK. So if you're ever in the UK, give us a shout, normally London channel. I'm sure we can arrange something. Any excuse for the pub. Right, at DataJar, we help organizations manage their Apple devices. Be that advising organizations that self-manage and getting them started, managing devices with organizations, or managing devices on behalf of organizations as an MSP. With roughly a 50-50 split between business and education, with education just slightly edging it. There you go. Good start. The point of this is basically we're dog fooding this stuff. All the things I'm going to talk about we're already doing for our customers. And today I'm going to talk about the new thing with Adobe Education. This talk's going to look to cover all the above areas. That you should be able to find the Slack channel for this room. And secondly, I'm going to have a link to a blog post at the end of this. Hopefully should go live most of the way through. So don't be in a massive rush to take too many notes if you don't feel you want to, or if you want to jot down URLs, things like that. I'm going to swap the adapter. Sorry, bear with me. That one doesn't work either. Okay, we'll pursue with the original. Sweet, back. Cool, and last thing is I request you hold all questions to the end, because then hopefully we'll cover it as part of it, and if not, we can go through there. So, let's start at the beginnings. I'm going to take you on a short history lesson. Most of this might be familiar to you folks. So in the beginning, as with most paid-for software versions, we have serial number license, or SNL. Standard 24-character mixture of numbers and letters that equate to whatever license you've purchased. This could cover a single app or multiple apps grouped in collections like Web Premium, Master Collection, that kind of stuff. And depending what kind of license you bought, this could be for an individual device or a site license that would cover your entire fleet. In the majority of cases, these are valid forever. Majority of cases. But on the flip side, they're also only valid for the version of Adobe you purchase. So if you purchase a license for CS5, it only works on CS5. As for mass deployment, in the beginning, at least of my Mac admin career, we had the Adobe packaging tool called Adobe Application Manager Enterprise Edition, or AAMEE for short. This came with CS5 and looked a little like this. Brings back memories, eh? Maybe nightmares. Depends how well you went with your deployments. This came along with CS5, provided a host of advantages, including converting the normal installers that you'd download into something more mass deployable in most cases. But it had some disadvantages. It required the use of a locally installed application in order to package these things. It must be packaged on the same OS that you are going to install it onto, so you can't build Windows packages on Mac and vice versa. And the packages have got to run on that booted OS when you deploy them in order to install successfully. With the launch of Adobe Creative Cloud, the successor to CS6, we had a new end-user tool called the Creative Cloud Desktop Application, or CCDA. This came with a host of features for the end user, allowing installation of updates and upgrades, as well as trials from within a single application. In later years, this could also be deployed with a helper tool, allowing non-admins the ability to run these installs themselves. By default, this will be deployed with all Adobe CC installations, regardless of whether you're deploying them yourselves or users downloading them manually. And the user would then use this tool as well to license their products via the named user licensing. Speaking of which, Adobe CC was built around the idea of a subscription license model over your traditional serial number license, aka the named user license, or the null. This allowed orgs to increase or decrease license count as required, rather than having to sit on unused licenses, but it does mean it's an ongoing cost versus a one-off cost. You'd buy your licenses either on your own, often personal Adobe ID, or the organization bought them separately and assigned them to users' Adobe IDs via the admin console. Users would log into the Adobe CCDA on their devices to license whichever applications you'd purchased for them. This allowed the use of same applications on devices other than corporate-owned assets or organizational-owned assets, allowing users to work from home or students to complete homework on their home computers. Along with the launch of Adobe Creative Cloud, we also needed a new deployment tool, the Creative Cloud Packager, or CCP for short. As its predecessor, AAMEE, this facilitated the converting of those packages into mass deployable versions. It worked with serial numbers, non-licensed deployments for named user license, and later on worked with the new device licenses. It allowed users access to download additional applications and updates themselves, and in some cases without even being an admin. In later versions, this also allowed the creation of update-only packages, cutting down on the size of update packages if you're deploying them that way. As it's still loosely based on AAMEE, it had the same sort of disadvantages. Locally installed application, you can only build packages on the OS you're running, not for other OSs. And the package has got to run on a booted OS in order to install successfully. In later times, Adobe added much of this functionality into their web console, but more on this later. A few years ago now, Adobe released a new concept called device licenses. This allowed the use of CC subscriptions, but maintained the device as the licensee rather than the end user for a named user license. These also replaced the one-off serial number cost with a yearly subscription cost. One of the issues with serial number licenses is you had no real visibility on which devices had that deployed, and therefore you didn't know if you were close to or perhaps over your license count. With the device licenses, upon installation, the device registers itself with its host name in your Adobe console. With that visibility, you could also deactivate a license. And this is how things were for a few years. Periodically, Adobe would add some new features, maybe some new options and improvements to deployments and new management workflows. These included some things we've already mentioned, allowing non-admin users the power to install updates, upgrades, and trial versions, and allowed the creation of update-only packages. Then in mid-October last year, Adobe announced CC2019. Rather than just a standard, a bit large update cycle, this also included some heavy changes to deployment and licensing workflows for organizations. Ben, aka Matt Mule, did a great write-up at the time. But in summary, CCP can no longer be used to package 2019 applications. These have got to be created in your admin web console. And both serial number licenses and device licenses will be decommissioned starting at the end of 2019. Named user licenses would have to be used instead. For those of you that operate any form of labs with Adobe, the reaction was something along the lines of this. Same with us as well. Adobe did eventually clarify things with a follow-up email sent to customers. Any serial number license you had that was still valid, even beyond that end of 2019, would continue to function until that actually expired, even if this was after the date of decommissioning of all those kind of old licenses. Just over 3 months later, Adobe finally announced a more suitable replacement for licensing in typical lab environments. Ben, again, did another great write-up, linked above. But again, in summary, serial number licenses and device licenses cannot be used to license Adobe 2019 products. These need to either use the named user license or a newly announced shared device license program. Either way, users must log into an Adobe suite with an identity of some kind in order to use these applications. Excuse me. Which brings me to the core material of this session, the new world. Earlier this year, Adobe announced and released the new shared device licenses. This is designed as a replacement for your shared serial number licenses and device licenses of Adobe's past. There is a user login requirement, and this is a departure from previous licensing models, but provides some benefits such as allowing users access to cloud-based assets, including storage, fonts, images, and libraries, and allowing the proper deployment and use of Adobe XD. Late May 2019, Adobe also launched version 1.5 of the SDL with some features around multiple access policies. All right, enough of the history lesson. We kind of covered that, we covered what's the new stuff. Next up, how you can prepare yourselves for your deployments. And with such a large number of changes with that deployment, you can have a deep dive into this to ensure you'll kind of understand the various options and the key differences. A lot of things to cover under this one. So most of these are kind of user management-esque and user authentication. And that kind of matches the largest areas of change with the Adobe 2019 changes. So as mentioned a couple times already today, and there'll be a couple more, your users are going to need to log into an Adobe identity in order to use your shared device license. And you've got three options here. You've got an Adobe ID, an Enterprise ID, and a Federated ID. Let's have a quick look at Adobe IDs first. These are IDs created within your Adobe portal or within CCDA by end users. The account is stored within Adobe, and Adobe will handle the authentication. This means they'll also apply their default password policies. Any email address whatsoever can be used for the ID, and if you invite a user, they simply need to accept the invite and create an ID if they don't already have one. This will then add them to your console, and you can then assign them licenses. All the data they create is legally owned by the end user. Admins cannot monitor or control the data or content in those accounts. On this flip side, though, of that, if a user then leaves your institution, they can retain that data historically. Much the same as keeping hold of exercise and textbooks, I imagine. The last point here is users must be over 13 years old. So if you've got any students who are under that age, you will not be able to use an Adobe ID in this scenario. Enterprise IDs, these are a little different. So these are owned by the organization. The account is stored within Adobe, and authentication is still performed by Adobe. But you can configure your own password policies via their methods. The email address has got to be a member of your email domain. Also more on this a bit later on. As with Adobe IDs, users will accept an invitation to the organizational email address and then create a password. As these are owned by the organization, any data is owned by the organization as well. So users won't necessarily have access to it when they leave. This also allows students under 13 years old. So this is kind of your first of your two options there. Last one's Federated IDs. So these are very similar to Enterprise IDs. The main difference has been the authentication will be handled by your identity provider instead of Adobe. The password policy and also an MFA policy, if you wish to use multi-factor, is what you've configured in your identity provider. And users will not need to accept any invitation or create a separate password. They can use whatever your identity provider password is. And again, users can be under 13 years old, and the ownership of the data will retain with the organization. A handy table of these points can be found in that KB article above. In my experience, education organizations tend to go for federated IDs for deployments, with a standard sort of let the user create it, Adobe ID, as sort of the second most popular option. The last key point to remember here is that none of these options alone are going to provision or create user accounts for your users. With the Adobe ID and the Enterprise ID options, it's not the end of the world, as users can create those as required. However, if you want to use federated IDs, you're going to need to get users into the system, and I'd suggest the user sync tool for this. The user sync tool is a Python-based utility. It sits on a local Windows box in your environment and can synchronize your user directory into your Adobe console in order to provision users. This can be used for both federated and enterprise IDs and saves you or your users having to manually create accounts or you having to maintain any changes to user population as people come and go. You can even configure certain Active Directory groups to automatically gain certain Adobe licenses once you've got your sync set up. This user sync tool could be a full session by itself, so I'm not going to delve in much further here. But there's two places I suggest you check out if you're interested in using it. The first one's the official Adobe documentation, which actually is pretty good. Surprise. And the second one is a great talk from Neil Martin, aka the Sound Mac guy even. He delivered that for one of the London Apple admin meetups a few months ago. It's about 20 minutes long, and we'll talk you through sort of full setup and most of the features. And don't forget as well, you can reach out to Adobe support for assistance with this should you be unsure of any areas here. What are your options if you don't want to use the user sync tool, or you can't for whatever reason? You can create the Adobe IDs manually, although if you're doing more than a handful, I'm not going to suggest that anyway. You could upload a CSV file. You just got to remember to redo that each time you have new users or a change in your users on that one. And lastly, there is APIs for the admin console that you can use to create and manage your users. So if you have your own bespoke systems internally, maybe got some devs on the house, you can have them maybe look at that as an option. So in order to create and store user information for federated or enterprise IDs, you're going to need to create an Adobe directory. This is also a requirement for the SAML SSO integration. It's pretty simple and straightforward, but it can take Adobe up to 48 hours to provision this if you're using federated IDs. Details can be found in the URL above, but it's probably the easiest part of your entire rollout. Along with directory, you're going to need to create an Adobe domain, or at least link your domain into Adobe. This will be used to store user authentication and to tie into your SAML and SSO provider if you're going to use federated IDs. It links email or your UPN to Adobe for authentication of user accounts via those email addresses. You'll need to add your domain and prove ownership through the use of a TXT record, similar to how you do G Suite or Office 365 setups. One gotcha. If your organization has multiple departments that each have access to their own independent admin console with Adobe, but they're both under the same larger domain, only the first console user to claim that domain will get access, and the other departments will not be able to register the domain. To get around this, one department can claim the domain and go through the full process, and other departments can request access, similar to a federated domain setup. In summary, if you plan to use enterprise or federated IDs with your admin console, you must add the domain associated with the organization. If this domain was previously added by another organization, you have to request access to the directory containing that domain as a trustee. Personally, I'd suggest you get your core IT teams or your central IT team to grab the domain first and have other areas of your organization request access in. Again, it's not a super difficult task to get this set up, but the main headache is going to come from having the right people at your organization around to help at the right time. And again, details for the full process can be found at that URL above. The last step in that area is just to link that directory and domain. Again, that's covered in the KB article. It's like a one-button press on that one. As mentioned, you're going to have users log into Adobe apps each time they log into a Mac, or indeed a PC. This process can be smoothened somewhat through the use of SAML SSO via an IDP. The specifics on how you'd go about this vary greatly depending on the identity provider and your own requirements. Again, this is outside the scope that we're going to cover today, but you can find Adobe documentation linked above. They've got specific guides for Microsoft AD Federated Services, Okta, OneLogin, and Oracle Identity Federation, which to be honest I hadn't heard of before I started looking at it. And don't forget, again, you've got Adobe support. They will deal with this. They will help you out with this process. They understand it's a big change. All right, that was a ton on the various options and setups for Adobe user creation. How about the actual deployment? What should you know before you start building your first packages? The Adobe 2019 apps will require macOS 10.12 or newer. So if you're holding out on OS upgrades, this is something you may need to reconsider. If you're going down the shared device license route, and if you're here, I get the impression you probably are, this is not going to work with CC2018 or older. I think this is the first Adobe upgrade in a long time where you're not going to be able to run an older version side by side. Last little comment on this sort of area, if you go in 2019, it's got to be shared device license or named user license. Skip aside. CCDA handles the user login. So if you're previously removing this from your deployments, stop, because you'll break CC2019. If you're deploying shared device licensed apps, the CCDA will automatically have the apps and updates panel hidden. This license model is designed for lab environments, multi-user environments. And Adobe have, and in my opinion, a great choice and to disable those by default and assume your admin's going to be managing those updates, whether that's through building packages or using a remote update manager or RUM. You don't really want your labs going out of sync with each other because one user decided to upgrade here and upgrade there. So it kind of makes sense on that one. And it's one of the good assumptions they've made, I feel. Adobe File Sync. Part of the reason Adobe moved to requiring an Adobe ID login is to allow users to get the full features of apps and resources offered by Adobe, some of which are free for education. Adobe File Sync enables the use of Adobe Cloud Storage for files, as well as access to libraries, fonts, and collaboration features. I know a lot of you may be looking to disable this feature, and this is possible for education-only customers when building your SDL packages. However, there's a few bits and pieces to bear in mind. If you hit that Learn More option, you'll see this above warning. If you disable Adobe File Sync for your deployments, the non-classic version of Lightroom and Adobe Rush are not going to be usable, and cloud assets such as storage, libraries, and fonts are not going to be available to end users. So bear that in mind, maybe chat to your lecturers and staff members to make sure that's not going to cause problems. Also, if you check out the Creating NUL Packages KB article linked above, you'll see some interesting wording around disabling the sync feature. Specifically, the comment of useful in a test environment. Does this mean Adobe do not suggest disabling this in production? Not clear. Either way, my suggestion will be to enable the file sync option unless you have a very specific need not to. So, understanding education is common to trash user home areas, even outside of education, or subsections of a user's home area on a periodic basis, or perhaps at logout. Hopefully at logout, not the one they logged in. That'll be interesting. When using the Adobe File Sync option, this is also going to seem like a potential attractive way to deal with the increased local storage requirements. As with all these things, there's some caveats here. There does seem to be some caching of bits and pieces with that file sync process. If you were to delete the contents of Adobe File Sync folder when the user's logged out, it will break the local sync for that user the next time they log in. In order to bring that user back to fully working order, you need to delete the entire local account on that Mac and restart the Mac. So probably don't delete chunks out of that sync folder itself. If you regularly trash user home folders in their entirety, say at logout, that can also break the sync. However, adding in a restart after you delete that user account seems to make things work well. So if you do need to do this, maybe consider switching to maybe an out-of-hours removal and restart process, maybe overnight, that kind of stuff. That kind of stuff seems to work better on Windows PCs, so perhaps it's something they're going to improve on the Mac side, hopefully. Right, so we've covered the options around Adobe ID management and some considerations around deployment. Last thing to discuss is licenses. What are the core changes and what are your options going forward? I've mentioned a few areas of license expiry, so let's dig in a bit further here. So those of you that are using named user licenses, that's not going to expire as long as you keep paying Adobe money. It's also going to be perhaps the only way you can run older versions of Adobe alongside 2019 and keep it licensed. Device licenses, that's going to continue to work on Adobe non-2019 deployments until it expires. As mentioned in that linked webinar, you can renew your existing device license up until September this year, 2019. So if you've timed your renewal well and you don't need 2019 yet, you should be able to carry on with device licenses until next summer. Great if there's no way you're going to get stuff ready before the new semester. Just bear that in mind. But check with your reps, check with Adobe, get that stuff sorted out and decided beforehand. You don't want to rely on that and then find out you've missed a window. However, what overrides all of that, as soon as you click your migrate button and migrate to shared device licenses, your existing device licenses will expire within 30 days. That includes ones that are already deployed out to devices. So when you're going to do this migration, make sure you're ready to go. Serial number licenses. So as with device licenses, these will continue to work on existing Adobe deployments, non-2019, until they expire. For most education customers, this looks like 2021, but check with your reps again, check with who's got the licenses. And again, so that means if your expiry is good and you don't need 2019 yet, you should be able to continue as you are. If you're not sure when your serial number licenses expire, go for that link there. That'll give you an idea. Sorry, in case anyone missed it. There will be a post at the end with copies of this, as well as a list of all the URLs. So what's the deal with the new shared device license? Well, SDL handles the licensing of applications only. Doesn't deal with the storage, doesn't deal with any other entitlements, just the storage. Just the applications. A device will activate its shared device license against Adobe the first time a user logs in with an Adobe ID. This did change with the release of 1.5, and the activation now happens when you deploy that package as well. When a user does log into an Adobe device, this login is cached. So a user can log out of a Mac, then log back into that same Mac, and still be authenticated against Adobe. Although that's true, Adobe do recommend users log out of their Adobe session before they log out of their Macs. They haven't specified a particular reason why, and things do seem to work fine if you don't, so treat that with a pinch of salt. As mentioned, SDL only covers the apps and nothing else. So you can assign users additional licenses to cover storage and other features. For example, the Spark 2GB license is free for education. So it makes sense to just assign this to all your users by default. It also gives them access to resources as well as that 2 GB cloud storage. You could also assign these users the 100GB all apps plan, and they'll get access to 100GB cloud storage as well as access to the apps outside of your environment. You could even assign both, and they'll get a combined 102 GB storage. Why not? This license assignment is optional, but I would suggest assigning the Spark plan to all users just because it's free and it gives some benefits, so why not? Right, let's go over some implementation details, get more into the proper techie side of things. Right, as before, I've kind of split that into the list above. Hopefully break it down, make it a bit easier to absorb. Adobe do have a detailed deployment workflow that I've linked above, but I've got some short summaries here for you. If you're already using serial number licenses and you're migrating to shared device licenses, firstly, get your Adobe identity work completed. Create your directory, add your email domains, get them linked. Next, add your users to your Adobe console. Again, I suggest the user sync tool here, but if you have other options, you can use them as well. Buy if you need to, if not, enable your shared device licenses in the Adobe admin portal. Get your access policies sorted out, which we'll cover in a bit. Get those deployment packages built. Remove your existing CC deployments. As mentioned, this is optional with serial number licenses, but is recommended in most cases. Again, I'll cover this in a little bit. And lastly, get those 2019 packages and shared device licenses deployed. What about if you're on device licenses already? Not too different for this than for the serial number license. The main differences being you don't need to buy your licenses. If you already got your device licenses, there's a big migrate button. You hit that and it will convert them over. Once you migrate, you've got 30 days to get to the bottom of this list. And you can't use your shared device licenses of anything other than 2019. So you must remove previous versions of CC, otherwise they'll become unlicensed. Last scenario, what if you're already using named user license and you're migrating to named user license? This one's much easier. Ensure you're covered for CC2019 for named user license. You should be if you're paying your bills. Build your packages, maybe remove the old stuff if you want, and deploy 2019. Next up is the big part, getting your license management sorted. Don't forget there's no longer any device licenses after we go through these steps. Serial number licenses will continue to work until they expire, but then they're also going to stop. So quick run through the different migration paths. If you're running named user licensing, just keep paying Adobe money. Just double check you're covered, but that's literally it. Nice and easy. What about serial number licenses? In some cases, you're going to need to speak to Adobe or your Adobe reseller and buy some SDL licenses as a first step. However, any active SDL licenses you have already deployed will continue working until they expire, just not those 2019 apps, so keep that in mind. Some organizations, that means they're going to be fine for a little bit longer. One last thing here, if you're under Adobe's ETLA agreement, the Enterprise Team License Agreement, you should be able to just enable SDLs in your admin portal right now. And keep using your existing serial numbers while you're messing around and getting things ready. Lastly, what about device licenses? For those who aren't using device licenses, feel free to tune out a bit here and tune back in when we get to license profiles. Push the migrate button. Nice and easy. Adobe got another great KB article on the full migration process, linked above. That migration button is going to be in your admin console where you can view your licenses. Once you press that, all of your device licenses will be migrated to an all apps license for your fleet. So if you've got Photoshop only licenses, they'll be migrated to a shared device all apps license. That's at no additional cost. They did mention in one or two webinars that there may be a true up at a later date, but it's been really tricky to nail down specifics on this. So again, discuss with your reps, discuss with your resellers. Once you press that migrate button and start the process, all your currently valid device licenses will expire in 30 calendar days. This will include deployed licenses. Ensure you're ready to go when you press that button and you have time to complete the migration and deployment work within that 30 days. Lastly, this is a one-way process, this migration. There's no takebacks, there's no undos, no Avengers time stone magic here. It's a one-way process. So what does that process look like? Log into your Adobe admin portal and you should see a little information button on your license or licenses. Hit that and hit migrate. Adobe will display a large warning at the top as well as some of their core benefits at the bottom. Click next here. Next, you're going to need to identify the organizational subsection you fall into. There's a number of possible options here and sort of related processes depending on where you fall into the kind of table. That KB article, step 4, that will get you to pick the right one for you. Last thing, you're going to get a confirmation message. Check all is well and correct and hit that migrate button. This could take up to a day, but tends to be hours, if not minutes in reality. Right, everyone can tune back in now, this bit. Right, for all shared device license deployments, you're also going to need to build up a license or an access profile. License profiles cover which types of Adobe IDs can log into your deployment and which public IP addresses are allowed to activate a license or log into a deployment. Previous to the end of May, we can only deploy one license profile to your entire deployment. With SDL 1.5, we can also use multiple profiles if you feel the need to. None of our customers have yet, so. Right, so you'll need to create at least one profile for those deployments. Log into your admin portal, click the products button at the top, click the correct license on the left-hand side, and click new profile on the right-hand side. Give this an appropriate name and click done, then go back into it. So this first section, you'll have the option of configuring the user access policy itself. This option controls what types of Adobe IDs can log into this deployment. You're going to have 3 options here. Open access. This allows any user with a valid Adobe ID to log into the deployment and use those apps. Great if you happen to also use these labs for members of the public, perhaps evening classes, that kind of stuff. It does also mean that any of your students who have their own Adobe IDs could also log in with those. Organizational user only. So this limits the logins to users you've added to your admin console. This includes both federated and enterprise users as well as ones you've created manually. Last option is enterprise or federated only. This limits those logins to just enterprise or federated users of your org. Oh, too far. Go back. Sweet. This second section allows you to specify particular public IP addresses. This is IPv4 only at the moment. That allow you to perform SDL logins. For example, if a user takes an installation package off your distribution service, or takes an already deployed laptop or even desktop off-site, you could limit them to not be able to log into the Adobe installs on that device or use those installation packages. And again, it could be used to discourage users from taking devices home unauthorized or connecting to guest networks, that kind of stuff. If you leave it blank, it's unset, it's not restricted at all. New with version 1.5, I keep clicking the button too many times. You can create multiple profiles. As a result, we're going to need a way of scoping those out. The first option you have here for scoping is an Active Directory OU. This does need devices to be bound to AD. So are you folks using Enterprise Connect and Nomad instead. But it's designed for labs, so it's probably not that big of an issue. This can only be used with leaf nodes, kind of the end OUs, and not higher level ones. And you simply add the name of the OU into the box, and you separate OUs onto their own line. The second option you have here for scoping is a device's LAN IP address. That's in that kind of a format, with multiple ranges separated by new lines. One other thing to note, if a device has both a valid Ethernet and Wi-Fi IP address, it's going to use the Ethernet IP address to decide this. Presumably it's using EN0 in the back end on that one. The last option is to scope into a particular deployed package installed on a device. If you do end up building a separate shared device license installer package or licenser package, you could, for example, target this. If you have a particular build that's for a library environment, you could target that. A few little gotchas around profiles. You're going to need to pick at least one scope for your devices. I suggest having a catch-all profile scoped to a package deployed to all your devices, and then various other options set to LAN IP or OU if required. On that note, if you have overlapping profiles, the higher in that list the options are, the more likely that the more they'll override the one previously. For example, let's say you have profile A is scoped to package XP install, which is at the bottom of the list. Profile B is scoped on LAN IP, which is middle of the list. And profile C is scoped on OU, and that's at the top of the list. And a Mac falls under all three. Profile C is going to take over and cancel out anything from the other two, as OU's higher up that list. For each Adobe Access profile, you can get a report of devices activated under that profile. This can be found on the profile's upper right menu as Create Report. Might be handy for some use cases. Excuse me. Right, so you've got your back-end stuff sorted. Let's move on to actually doing the deployment. With a lot of these migration workflows, it's either recommended or required to remove the older apps. You've got a few options with this. You could, the first one, and possibly longest one, you could wipe and reinstall your devices, nuke and pave them. Obviously, you're going to make sure you remove the most amount of stuff, most thoroughly, but it's quite a long way of doing things. And also make sure you remember to remove the old packages from your deployment system before you do this, otherwise you're just repeating yourself. Second option, when you created your original CCP packages, you'd also be issued an uninstaller package. If you still have these, you can use these to remove that specific app or apps. Third option, when you deploy your CCP packaged apps, and if they're using the new hyperdrive installers, which most are nowadays, you can use an included command line tool to uninstall your older apps. This is going to require you to supply the appropriate flags for that specific app or appropriate name, as well as the SAP code. Link above's got a lot more details on this. Last option, using the CCP app to build a uninstall all the apps package. I've covered this in the blog post linked above, but that can work for almost all versions of Adobe apps with a minimum of FAF. Just a reminder, again, post linked at the end that has these URLs, so don't worry too much about rushing to grab it. I had a competition with my boss about how I could create the longest URL possible. We're still not cheating. Right, so you've got the back-end stuff sorted, you've removed all your old apps. Next step is to build your CC2019 packages and get these pushed out. As mentioned previously, you can't use CCP to build these packages. They're going to have to be built in your admin console. Log into your admin console, click packages in the top bar, and click create a package to start the wizard. Pick your licensing type, hit next. Select your entitlement and click next again. Pick your platform and language you wish to use for this package, hit next. And now you get to pick your package options. Here you can disable the file syncing, enable run, which is recommended. Even if you don't intend to use it now, you might use it later. You can redirect to an internal Adobe CC. You can create a resources folder for adding your extensions and that kind of stuff, as well as install apps into a custom directory. In the example above, you can see the Adobe CC and the custom install directory are grayed out. This is because these options need to be configured in other areas of the portal first. So just remember that if you try and go through. Once you're happy, click next. And lastly, you'll see a summary of your choices. Once happy, click build package. You'll be dumped back in the main packages screen whilst Adobe does its thing. Once that packaging is complete, the status will change from up to date, or to up to date rather, and you'll have 3 days to download that package before the download expires. This build process can take anything from a few minutes to a few hours depending on how under load Adobe is. When they released their new 1.5 SDL license, things slowed down dramatically. I assume it's a bit like Apple when they release a new OS update or upgrade, things start to crawl for the first 24 hours. Once you've built and downloaded all the installers you need, chuck them in your deployment system of choice and fire away. So what happens when those downloads expire? What happens when there's updates to those apps in the packages you've built? Currently, if the download expires, but the apps in the package are still up to date, the only option you're going to have is to recreate that package again, go through those steps again. I've got mixed feelings on this because it is kind of irritating. But if you're creating the packages, you're probably going to download them pretty soon after you create them. You're kind of not going to create them and go on holiday for 3 weeks. So, negligible impact. For packages where the content's no longer up to date, say that Photoshop package you built before has got some new updates in it, you can update the package and then re-download the new one. Handy if you can't use Remote Update Manager. Log into your admin console and find the package in question. Click on it to see this sidebar pop up, and that shows kind of what items are included in that package, the options you set, and details of which installs are out of date. In this case, it was Premiere Pro. Click Update Package. Optionally, give your package a new name, then pick one of the 2 options. The first option is going to build a new package with full installers for only the updated apps from the original package. So in this example, it would just do Premiere Pro and nothing else, ignoring the fact there's nothing else in that package. The second option is going to build a new package with full installers for all the apps in the package, including any updates where relevant. So essentially pick one of those 2, hit that build update package. This will then be packaged and made available in the console as before. Right, we've covered a lot of technical detail, and I know that's only part of the puzzle. With all these new features and requirements, how are you meant to know what's normal behavior for your end users? I've got some short clips and screenshots of the type of things your end users are going to see when using CC2019 with shared device licenses. Hopefully help you understand what might not be normal behavior. Firstly, and this has all been done via SAML as well, so these are all full federated IDs. What happens when a user logs into a Mac and launches the any SDL application? In this example, we're going to use Photoshop, and they have a Kerberos ticket. This ticket could come from logging in with an AD account, or it could come from using Nomad. So, first things first, running a klist command just to show we've got a valid Kerberos ticket. And then we're going to launch Photoshop. This is about ×2 speed. Otherwise you'd be here for bloody ages. Right, Photoshop's launched. CCDA then pops up, asks for the user to log in. User enters their username and tabs or clicks to the password field. User could put any UPN in that username field, any at all. CCDA will only use a domain at that stage to redirect to the IDP. IDP redirection has happened. User has to enter their login username again, or UPN. Check. And Kerberos ticket's then used to authenticate the user, and Photoshop completes its launch. That's it, pretty much. So that's kind of a normal, it could be very much more improved, but that's a standard working SAML sort of login. What if the user launches the CCDA instead of an Adobe app with that same scenario? So as before, K-list to show we've got a valid Kerberos ticket, single sign-on ticket. We click the CCDA app in the menu bar and enter our username. We tab or click into the password field, and we should get redirected to our IDP. Check. We have to enter our login username again. So again, still the same sort of behavior at this point. And then we'll see a new pop-up from Adobe asking us for a username and a password. This time we're going to need to enter our Adobe username and password. The Kerberos ticket is not used. So saying if this user has a Kerberos ticket, but if they launch the CCDA first, it will not use the Kerberos ticket. Can be tricky if it's not I wouldn't say it's a standard workflow. People normally go straight to the app they want to use, but bear that in mind. From a troubleshooting point of view, that also means you can override the login session. So if a user is logged into a different test account, you can then log in as someone else into the Adobe console via the CCDA without having to do like a K-destroy and that kind of stuff. Right, so lastly, what if a user launches a CC2019 app without a Kerberos ticket on that one? So once again, these are all ×2 speed. They weren't originally, so you're welcome. Don't have a Kerberos ticket, we're going to launch Photoshop. Hence the kind of the hyperactive bouncing in the menu bar, the dock even. CCDA asks for your user login again. You chuck your username in there, tab or click into the password field. That should redirect you to your identity provider. Enter your UPN again. And then you ask for your password by the identity provider again, and then the user will be authenticated, the apps will launch. If you aren't using SAM or SSO, the behavior is kind of a mix of that and the second behavior there where you get the Adobe pop-up asking you to log in. So it saves a bit of time perhaps, the users aren't having to actually type their password in again, but they kind of still have to type in everything else. So it might not be worth the effort, it might be worth the effort. It's up to you folks to decide. So as I mentioned before, these user activations are cached within the user session and survive logouts and in some cases restarts. As a result, the CCDA will display a message to the user every 90 minutes requesting they confirm they're still the Adobe user that's logged in. Looks a little like that. Users can click that continue button to carry on their use of the Adobe products, or sign out to log themselves out of the Adobe console, out the Adobe session, and then log in as someone else. Some words of warning here. This will stop any rendering in Premiere Pro or After Effects when it pops up. Had a groan. The pop-up can appear also once per Adobe app you have open. So if you've got multiple apps open, you might see that pop up multiple times. Both of those have been logged as bugs and marked as bugs by Adobe, so expect a fix on that one. As for the 90-minute pop-up itself, there's currently no configurable options here, but apparently it's on the roadmap to allow you to change some areas around that. No more details on that, I'm afraid. I'm hoping they'll give you a way of at least pushing it back to maybe 3 hours or maybe just not doing it. But it's to encourage users to make sure that the correct user who's logged into or sitting in front of the computer is the one that's logged into Adobe. All right, in this talk I've tried to cover as much as possible, but you may still want assistance or advice. So I'll briefly cover support options. Adobe actually has a great number of KB articles. I know I've read most of them now, just for this talk. And I'll link the ones in the blog post that I found the most useful. Again, the URL for that will be at the end. It can feel like you're going down a bit of a rabbit hole with them, but persevere because it's just so much good information. It's really worth going through them. carving out a good bit of time to sit through them and go through them. Adobe have also completed lots of webinars on 2019, SDL, migration, usage, and now SDL 1.5. Again, they're linked in blog posts, and again, I'd really recommend spending the time, maybe blocking a day or two out of your work schedule just to go through them. Go through with a fine-tooth comb, make sure you're fully happy with stuff. Adobe do have a great system as well, where you can book a remote support session via their admin console with a product expert. This can be to answer questions, go through the process, and even just to review what you've already deployed or what you've already done to ensure it all kind of makes sense. These options are found in your admin console under that support section. So you want the last one there, the request expert session, and they'll have some sort of calendar pop up, and you can kind of book a time slot. Lastly, blogs and talks, like this one. Again, added a list of these to the blog post. More homework, I'm afraid, for you folks. Right, that's the bulk of the talk done. Still good on time. So last bit's kind of FAQs, everything else, stupid Adobe tricks. It's kind of everything that didn't really fit into any other areas, hence the FAQ bit. Firstly, what if you want to deploy a shared device license for 2019 over the top of a named user license deployment of 2019? Some people may recognize this as what can be done with 2018 previous, where you deploy your apps unlicensed and you deploy a license file afterwards that then converts them. This does work, and that's great because it means you can, so for example, MSP, we have probably hundreds of customers using Adobe. So we have one Adobe package that goes for all of our customers, and afterwards we'll deploy out their specific license package. So it means you don't have to have, I don't know, 5 copies of Photoshop with different licenses and have to keep track of that. And I then just spoke about that slide before it came up. But yes, essentially we create those packages as named user license packages. And if the customer is using a named user license deployment, they just get that job done. If they're using a shared device license, we'll then deploy that package afterwards. It is fully supported to deploy a shared device license of 2019 over the top of a valid serial number license of 2018. It says it there, so it's supported. It's on their KB article, linked, snapshotted, everything. In reality, we had some issues with this. It had a tendency to just remove the serial number license. So just be aware of that. If you experience it, raise support requests with Adobe, get it worked on, because apparently it's supported. Adobe says so. My recommendation, though, to be honest, might be just to cut your losses and just rip out all the old Adobe versions and just go 2019 with both feet. What about deploying 2019 over top of 2018 named user licenses? That will just work as normal. No, nothing fancy there. Nice and easy. Depending on your licensing agreement, you may not need to care about how many devices you're deploying your shared device license to. I believe this was the case for the ETLA customers. But again, check with your reps, check with Adobe. But some agreements you do have to keep track of how many devices you've licensed, which is great. But what if you're decommissioning a lab and swapping in some new kit? You're going to need to revoke those licenses or remove those licenses before you decommission them. How do you do that? First option you've got is a bulk deactivation. This is performed in the Adobe admin console, and you can trigger a mass deactivation of all the devices that come with that specific licensing policy or access policy. And that will then reduce your account by that many. Any devices that are still in use, next time a user logs in with Adobe ID, it will reactivate. This used to be the only method you could remove your licenses, was just to remove them from everything and let them all re-register. It can be a little heavy-handed, and you can only do it once every 7 days, but end users shouldn't really notice a difference. In the console, select products at the top, SDL products on the left, and then the product profile in question on the middle. Click those 3 dots and click Recover Licenses. You'll get one further confirmation message to make sure you haven't just fat-fingered those 4 steps. Second option you've got here is a selective or individual deactivation. This is performed using the Adobe Licensing Toolkit binary. The Adobe Licensing Toolkit can be downloaded from your portal, Packages, Tools, Licensing Toolkit. and you need to then deploy that to the devices. Once it is, you've got the above commands, you can deactivate and activate SDL licenses on that device if you need to do it that way, or you'd rather do it that way. Using a shared device license on staff devices. Adobe's guidelines here, and this is a question between yourselves and Adobe. If there can be multiple users using that same device, shared device license is fine. Go for it. If not, say it's a one-to-one deployment for that particular device, they should be using named user license. If you log into a shared device licensed device with a named user license user, it's not going to use up one of those activations. So it's quite an attractive thing to use SDL. But don't forget, every 90 minutes they're going to get that pop-up. And they're not going to be able to run any updates or upgrades, which some faculty members might not be cool with. I've had both those scenarios. It's always fun. So maybe reconsider that. Maybe you do go for named user licenses for your one-to-one devices and shared for your shared, which kind of makes sense. Cool. CCDA, the desktop app. You can edit the config file to change the behavior. Good old Ben Toms, Macmill, covered that for pre-2019 on that post linked above. And Neil Martin, Sound Mac guy, covered this recently for 2019, along with some crazy experiments he was playing with that. Essentially, the file to edit lives in that location and allows you to control both the functionality of features for the suite, as well as what are displayed to end users. Neil covers this in great detail, and if it's something you're interested in, I suggest reading his post linked before. But as a heads up, it's not something Adobe officially support. So here be dragons. You have issues after you do it, Adobe are going to kind of tell you to jog on that one. Use of a single local user account. One question I get a lot is how can you use it with a single user account for all their users in a lab? As in, like, they have user 1 for Mac 1, user 2 for Mac 2, and that kind of stuff. Especially if you're not wiping that data, my first gut reaction is normally to suggest looking at alternatives. As possible, there's other issues around sort of data leakage, user privacy, that kind of stuff. Saved passwords being nicked from one student, that kind of stuff. Putting that aside, the new SDL workflow should work with a local account without any issues. It will work with local account, but there's currently no supported method to force an Adobe ID logout. You're going to need to rely on users logging out of that CCDA manually and then logging out of the Mac. One possible solution, and to be honest, it's not one I've had a chance to test, is to try using the built-in guest account for that scenario. It auto wipes that logout and is built into the OS, so it's going to be supported for ages. And I'd assume that clearing out that local user via that method should also remove the Adobe ID logged in status. But again, it just needs to be tested. If anyone tries this and gets anywhere with it, chuck it in the Adobe channel. It'd be awesome. Something that's hurt us as an MSP. With the switch away from CCP for packaging, I'm afraid we've also lost access to the use of auto-package to automate that checking, downloading, and packaging of Adobe apps. Currently, there is no sign of replacement functionality, but I'd suggest reaching out to your Adobe reps and making your voices heard. The more noise you make, hopefully the more likely they'll sort it out. Who knows? But we at DataJar, mostly Ben, to be honest, we've developed something that can hopefully help you import Adobe CC2019 apps once you've downloaded them into both Monkey and Jamf. We've linked it above. The idea being you'd create and start your download of each of your Adobe packages. You would then unzip them, and you'd run the script in the README. That will then go through your local downloads folder and import each Adobe app. That will include the uninstaller packages, as well as having a correct installs array and smart groups and things like that. Cuts down a lot of faff really with doing it all manually. Any feedback on this, let us know, chuck it in the issues. Pull requests accepted? Hopefully we'll help things, help restore some ease of use. A little gem that appeared in May this year. It appears Adobe's revoked the rights to older versions of their apps. Again, I've detailed it in the post above. But generally speaking, if you're running anything older than CC2018, generally speaking, you should remove and replace it with 2018 or 2019. If you don't, you'll be under risks of claims of infringement by third parties. If you don't wish to do this, or indeed you can't, I'd really suggest reaching out to both Adobe and your internal legal and compliance departments for options here. I am not legal advice. I'm also not Adobe as well, so please bear that in mind with these things. And towards the end of May this year, Adobe announced the release of SDL 1.5. This added new features around the use of the multiple access policies, access policy scoping, and delegated administration of those policies. So you could maybe assign responsibility for a particular lab to a particular person to then deal with the access policies. I've updated this talk throughout with the changes and the affected areas have been noted where relevant. If you do want to take advantage of those features and you've already got, say, 2019 deployed, there's no rush, you don't have to redeploy it, but if you just push out a new SDL license package, a newly generated one, that will then upgrade them behind the scenes kind of thing. This one came out at the end of last month, so it was a very quick edit on this one. In the later part of this year, Adobe are going to provide a method for students using your education accounts, i.e. your federated or your enterprise accounts, to migrate their assets into a personal ID. More information can be found above, but essentially what that means is that you can use your you can use the Adobe IDs that mean you guys retain access to the data, and when a student leaves, they can then access and take that data back with them. So they've got resources when they move on to new places and jobs and things. Almost there. Lastly, I've got to give some thanks and credit to certain people. Obvious one is the folks here at PSU, for letting me come up here and bore you all on Friday at 9 AM. Tough crowd. Big thanks to Neil Martin he did a lot of work on the SDL testing with me, shared his discoveries, as well as helped me with content for the talk. All the folks in the Adobe channel, again, information discovery sharing, as well as acting as a sounding board for some concepts around this. And that's it. Done. Thank you. So that post should probably be live more or less now, and there should be a catch box fling its way into your head anytime soon.
So I'm one of those users who has one account, as I mentioned before. But you said the cache is saved on the user local?
I believe it's saved within that local user's account.
Okay.
It's not something I've had a chance to fully test. Unfortunately, being who we are, we as a company stick to supported workflows, because if it goes wrong, we can go, Adobe, make it work.
Okay, because we use the default template, so which when it logs off, it deletes moves their stuff away. So I ideally shouldn't have that problem, but just
sure.
My concern about the syncing file is.
I mean, you can always deploy Adobe with file sync disabled initially, and at a later date change it, or even change it for only certain labs. You can do an SDL package maybe that just has one with the syncing turned on and one with the syncing turned off. That'd be Adobe supported method. Otherwise, Neil Martin's post about the config file has ways of how you can kind of flip it on and off programmatically. Headshot.
Just a couple comments I had while you were presenting. For those of us in higher ed with in-common federation, Shibboleth is a common SAML2 identity provider. We're using it at RIT, so just so you guys know, that works. And along with that, the login window, when you have to type in your user UPN like 3 times, we were given the insider tip that if you just do your domain, so in our case, if you just do ret.edu at that window and hit tab, it'll direct you to the your IDP a bit faster. So it's a little bit shorter if
Yeah.
you have some longer usernames, so just your domain should kind of redirect you to your SSO.
Awesome. Thank you.
I had a question. Are the updates that you download, are those cumulative? Or can you break, like, there's an update to Photoshop, there's an update to InDesign. Every time you go back, do you get InDesign and Photoshop? Or
That's the option you can pick. So when you build a new update package, it will have a full install in there for starters. So you can use it as both a update, and an initial install, which is quite helpful. Helpful for us at least. If you've got 2 items in the package and only one of them has updates and you rebuild that package, you've got those 2 options. I'm going to see if I can find it now. You basically got those 2 options, so you can decide whether you're going to deploy both of them within that package, or just say if you had Photoshop and InDesign and Photoshop had an update, Photoshop, you could say I'll just have Photoshop in there. I'll find it later. So you can pick basically. So if you have a package with say 3 items, 1 item has an update, you can either build an update package just for that 1 item, or you can build it all 3 and just reuse the same thing.
Thank you.
You're
And
welcome.
I had one other question. Can you do all the identity work before you migrate?
Yes, please do.
Quick question about for the disabling the user's ability to sync their stuff, like in labs, which
Mhm.
that depending on how much a user can have, that can be very detrimental to network and space on the machine. If I've currently created all the packages with that disabled, if for some reason I wanted to enable that, if I just repackage like the CCDA app and deploy that, will that overwrite the settings for all the apps, or would I have to redeploy all the apps?
So what I'd suggest in that scenario is you rebuild your package without any apps ticked, which will give you just a CCDA and your SDL license. You have that option enabled, the syncing option enabled, and that package, if you install that over the top, that should then enable syncing.
Okay.
I say Neil Martin's blog on the config file, you can actually edit that as well manually. Depends how brave you're feeling. You can edit that and then deploy that afterwards. Long shot.
Yeah, I'm not
All right.
So what happens if you, say, have a lab machine that is damaged or won't boot and it has an Adobe license stuck on it? Can you reclaim those from the console?
Yeah, it's via the console. Previous to 1.5, you would only be able to revoke all of your licenses. But bear in mind that you do that, as long as the user's not logged in, next time they launch Adobe, they'll still see the same screens, they'll still go the same process, but then the device do an additional quick reactivation. So you could potentially reset all from the admin console and just ignore everything else, and it should continue to work. Or you can revoke it from all of them and then push out that toolkit and relicense everything if there's any type of concerns around it. But yeah, it's a bit irritating. Actually, I should say previous to 1.5, you couldn't do it in the console either. You had to log a support ticket to pull licenses off from SDL. So we're making progress. So, down the front.
Just to clarify, if you have migrated your licenses, and will you still have to remove everything and repackage it and reinstall it?
So if you've removed...
If you've migrated your licenses already.
So what were your previous licenses?
They were device licenses.
Yes. You could leave the old stuff on there, but it would become unlicensed. So a user goes to launch, say, Photoshop 2018, and it'll ask them to log in with Adobe ID and then reject their existing one, or they'll get license errors because the Adobe ID they're on probably doesn't have the license for the older stuff. Unless it's a named user license, then there's probably a matrix here of different options. But short answer is, if your device license migrating to shared device license, I would strongly suggest removing the older apps. There's a couple of different methods on there that you can use for that.
Perfect.
First. Okay?
Thank you.
No worries. Going once. Going twice. 6 minutes early, sweet. Thank you very much, folks.